going to get started. My name is Tom Levine. I'm Cornerstone's technical specialist and commission specialist. And today we're going to cover some of what's new in tech for 2022 and focus also on how to actually get a decent computer right now. It's a little bit strange and technology is always changing. So it's difficult to know exactly what you're looking for and how long your device will last. So hopefully we'll be able to answer those questions for you today. Before we do get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions about anything I'm going over during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question box there. I might not get to it immediately, but I will answer it by the end of the presentation. Additionally, you can feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any specific questions that you don't want to ask as part of the webinar. You can reach out to me directly at 513-487-5390. That's the direct line for me at the office, so I can answer any questions there. Or you could send me an email at tlevine@crnstone.com. I do filter out by subject line though, so if you include Tech Tuesday in any question you ask, that'll help me get to it faster. And two other announcements, I guess. First off, we have an online launch event for our updated AGB platform. That's happening on May 19th, although the launch itself is going to happen on June 1st. If you're interested at all in some of the changes coming up here at Cornerstone, you might want to go ahead and register for that webinar. Once again, that is May 19th at 10 a.m. And Sarah Lucas and I will be on that webinar. Me from the tech side, and Sarah Lucas for the group corner. Lastly, don't forget to consider Autopilot. Autopilot is part of our agency services program, and it's designed to help you make a plan for your business, your clients, and your family, no matter the situation. We provide some retirement assistance, succession planning. We have a client referral program, as well as a service agreement option. Find out more at www.crnstone.com/agency-services-program. So that being said, in order to shop and be a savvy consumer for computing devices, be it a tablet, a two-in-one, a smartphone, pretty much anything now, there are a few things you might want to know and some terms you might want to have familiar with or be familiar with. My apologies. The first is the CPU, and that's the most important part of pretty much any piece of technology you get nowadays. The CPU is the piece that makes a computer think. It's where all of the actual processing of data happens in your computer. So that's a pretty important part to know about. Relations to CPUs include a few other terms you might want to know. The first is Hertz, HRZ. That's the frequency that we use to measure how fast a computer will process information. A computer with a higher clock count or Hertz count, they're kind of used interchangeably, just means that it operates faster. So once again, higher Hertz mean higher processing speed. Additionally, the other important term you might want to know is RAM. RAM is actually an acronym for renewable access memory, but you can just think of it as your computer's short-term memory or ability to multitask. The amount of RAM determines how many programs you can run at once, maybe how many instances of Chrome you can use at once. And obviously, more expensive devices will have more of this RAM. Then there's also something else called storage or long-term memory of your computer. Sometimes companies will use the term memory interchangeably between RAM and your actual storage on your device, and that can make it a little bit tricky to parse out. Typically, if you see a larger number than like 32, it's talking about the actual storage capacity of your device. If you see a number that's equal to 32 or lower in gigabyte count, then you're likely talking about RAM or renewable access memory. And I know this is a lot of terms to keep straight, but I promise it'll get easier and you'll be able to kind of see more of what I mean by the distinction with that moving on when we get into some of the specifications of these devices. The last three terms you need to know all relate to data size. There are megabytes, gigabytes, and terabytes. And each of these is sort of like a standard measure for how much data something takes up. A megabyte is used to measure most file sizes. So if you have like a Excel document on your computer, chances are it's measured in megabytes. Gigabytes is the standard measure for actual solid amounts of memory or RAM in your computer. That's just because we've graduated from megabytes, we use a little bit more of a larger chunk of data to talk about that. And lastly is terabyte. Terabyte is something that normally computer nerds only knew, but nowadays it's starting to kind of filter into common speech. Basically, it's just 1,000 gigabytes. So if you see like a 500 gigabyte computer with like 500 gigs of memory, and then you see a computer with 1 terabyte, that computer with 1 terabyte has more memory. So just something to keep in mind. I also want you to keep these questions in mind when we're looking at these devices. First is, what's the difference between a Chromebook and a laptop? And which do I need for what I'm doing? The next is, why and when do I need to upgrade? Finally, is it time to switch to a phone with 5G? And what is the difference between a disk drive and a SSD? Or what type of drive do I need? And these are the other questions that you really need to keep in mind when looking. Let's go ahead and answer these a little bit out of order. First is it finally time to switch to a phone with 5G? And the answer is probably yes. The industry is moving to higher speeds, newer networks, and for the last 2 or 3 years, I've said to hold off of 5G phones. But now I think it's finally time to switch. I'll be showing a map on our next slide, actually, showing more of the actual layout of where 5G is and where it would be useful. And I think at least in Ohio, it's finally time to upgrade. One other thing to note about the industry's directions, though, before we move on, and my apologies for doing this out of order, we're looking for higher clock speeds. The industry is heading toward newer CPU architectures as well, and trying to focus on smaller devices with use of cloud storage over local storage. We also see larger caches, higher core counts in our CPUs, and Moore's law is nearing its limit. But I'll get more into that in a moment. Here's the current map of cellular coverage for Verizon, at least for Ohio. The dark red areas are where 5G is mainly located. The lighter red area indicates 4G, and then the super light pink indicates 3G or lower coverage. So this is just Verizon's map. Verizon is, I believe, the second most expansive 5G network currently in America. As you can see, they've got a lot of Cincinnati covered, a lot of Columbus covered, and quite a bit of our northern area as well up in Cleveland. They've also got Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and a few other towns around this sort of chunk of the United States. That's sort of why I say a 5G phone is probably going to be pretty useful now. There are some distinctions between what makes 5G work and what makes 4G work. So one of the main concerns that I had for recommending 5G phones originally was that 5G phones did not really interact with the 4G network at all. But they're actually making phones that interact with both right now. So I'd recommend going ahead and switching to a 5G phone. It will actually probably provide you with better connection. Anywho, back to looking more at specific devices. Those questions are what I would keep in mind now as we go through this. If you're looking for a phone or a tablet, I'd recommend something with at least 4 gigabytes of RAM for phones, or 6 gigabytes for tablets. And if you can find a tablet or cell phone with 8 gigs of RAM, that'd be great. Once again, that's the renewable access memory. That's just sort of how your computer can multitask. And a phone is really just a pocket computer nowadays. So 8 is great, 4 is the minimum, and then 6 is probably what you'd end up getting. The storage size for one of these devices, I'd recommend getting at least 128 gigabytes. Sorry, my camera likes to move around on me a bit. There we go. But 128 is still rather low. I would say maybe go for at least 234 or higher, but 128 is probably all you need as long as you use the cloud quite a bit. Then there are also the ports and utilities of your device to consider. This is something like with the newer iPhones. They only have one port, so you can either charge your device or you can have something else plugged in to your phone. So that's something else to consider when you're looking at your devices. Also, if you care about it, the camera, a lot of standard phone cameras nowadays are pretty high resolution, so it's not something you need to really get in depth about unless you take a lot of photos, but it's something to consider, along with the display size, because that'll determine how big your device is, and what carriers support it if it's a phone or a tablet. They all use ARM processors, which are a little weird, so I wouldn't really shop based on how computation heavy the computer is, I guess, for a phone or a tablet, but it's just something to consider if you care a lot about, the quality of your phone. For desktops and laptops, however, there are different things to look at. This would be things like the features of the CPU, being threads and architecture. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but Moore's law is kind of nearing its limit. And what Moore's law was kind of a statement in the 90s. And it basically said that every 2 years you can expect computers' processing power to double. And the number of computations that can happen to increase, and that's just based on how many transistors we can fit onto a silicon chip. Transistors are the part of your CPU that actually holds the ones and zeros that get added together to make the computer faster and process data. Basically, we're kind of nearing the limit of that. So the number of transistors we can fit onto a silicon chip doesn't really increase anymore. So whereas before with, maybe the 9th gen and 6th gen or sometime through there, older Intel chips and older AMD chips and computers in general, the size of the transistor mattered a lot more than it does now. Nowadays, it's all about how the computer is actually using the resources that it's being given, since those resources can't really be increased anymore. The other thing you need to consider is the RAM amount, once again. For a desktop or a laptop, I would say you need at least 16 gigabytes nowadays. That number used to be 8, but computing is, increased in power, and the file sizes that we use are much higher. So I'd recommend at least 16 gigabytes of RAM in a desktop or a laptop. Also, you want to consider where the storage is. And this is sort of why I mentioned that question earlier. Do I need a Chromebook or do I need a laptop? Because there's a big difference. Chromebooks normally don't have that much storage. They might have anywhere between, 50 gigabytes and 128 megabytes. There are gigs, I'm sorry, gigabytes for all of those numbers. It's really not like a large storage kind of device. Chromebook is kind of like a tablet or a phone more than like a desktop or a laptop. And what it means is, yeah, it can do things that you can stream on it. You can, use it the same way you'd use your phone, but you wouldn't want to run like Microsoft Excel in full on it. You wouldn't want to save a bunch of things directly to it. So if you're just using, cloud-based resources and online sites, maybe you want a Chromebook over a desktop or a laptop. But if you're doing a lot of data processing, if you're actually saving a lot of data to your computer, or if you need to run those files locally, you might want to consider a desktop or a laptop. So just something to consider. You also might want to consider portability if you're looking at a laptop or a 2-in-1, and battery life as well. Although battery life nowadays is pretty large anyway, they don't normally include short battery life products anymore. It's just kind of fallen out of market trend. So with that being said, there are 2 phones for Android at least that I would recommend in our current market. The first is the Galaxy S22, and that is the newest generation Galaxy product. It is available from Verizon at least. These are the numbers that I used for $239.99, and that is for the 256 gigabyte version with a rebate. However, without the rebate, it's $849.99. Obviously, this could come in different payment plans. It just depends on what Verizon is offering, and there are a lot of different local deals as well. It has a Snapdragon 8 processor, which is a ARM processor. It's not Intel, it's not AMD, it's not any like known name, but ARM processors are what you'll find in a lot of phones and tablets. It has 8 gigabytes of RAM and is an S series phone. Samsung's, or at least the Galaxy phones, have letters that denotate sort of how far down in complexity they are. The S series is like their standard series. It's what they launch as like usable for pretty much any person. But you don't really actually need an S series phone. My phone actually is a Galaxy as well, but it's a kind of young Galaxy, I guess I'd say. It's a Galaxy A20. And that's just the standard series Samsung. It's like the cheapest you can get. Mine ran maybe $300, and I got it back in 2020. They've started labeling them by year of production. So the Galaxy S22 is a 5G phone. That is kind of their latest in the line. If you're looking for something a little lighter than that, you might want to go with an F series or an A series. The A series only has 3 gigabytes of RAM too, so I don't really multitask on my phone. You might want a little more if you tend to do that. And it also has different dimensions as well. 6.1-inch display is pretty standard for the Galaxies, and it has a 50 megapixel wide or a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera with 3 times zoom, and it's a 10 megapixel. Sorry, I flipped that there with autocorrect for the front camera. The other option, if you're an Android fan, is the Pixel 6. That's one of my favorite recommendations as well right now. The reason I like the Pixels is because for the Google phones, the Pixel is actually a really decent product at a very good price. The Titan M2 chip is relatively similar to the Snapdragon 8 processor and its capabilities, so you don't really lose much there, even though you are going down about $200 in price. It has 8 gigs of RAM, same as the Galaxy S22, and it has a larger display that displays at 90 hertz. The Galaxy S22 actually doesn't advertise on its screen refresh rate, so it's probably more around 60. But the Pixel 6 having a higher screen refresh rate means it'll feel more fluid in your hand. So as you swipe left and right on your screens, you should notice that it kind of feels a little more fluid. It also has a exactly similar camera to the Galaxy S22, so you're not really losing anything. Now, one other thing I wanted to note is I don't actually have a slide for Apple devices right now, as far as phones go, and that's because there really hasn't been much change in the device capacity for the last 3 years. They have more memory as you go up through the series for the last 3 years, but really the capacity of the chip and what it's processing hasn't changed that much. If you get an iPhone from the last 3 years, it'll probably work just as well as the other iPhones. So, there haven't really been many changes there. But as far as the iPads go and the desktop computers, that's really where they've been focusing a lot of their innovation recently. Which brings me to desktops. There are 2 main chip competitors for desktop computers. That's desktops and laptops. That would be AMD and Intel. AMD stands for Advanced Microdynamics, and Intel is just Intel. It's like the first big computer chip market people around. One thing I wanted to note is that recently AMD actually kind of took over as the #1 choice for desktop CPUs. It didn't used to be that way at all. If you talk to a computer person for the last 6 years probably, they would say, hey, you really just want to go for an Intel machine for your computer. It's just going to be more reliable. Not really as much anymore. AMD, like I said, they're now the top choice for 2021 CPUs. They have been working on architecture changes and increasing their chip complexity for a while. If you're going to go with a Ryzen machine, which is AMD's offering, you likely want a Ryzen 5 or a Ryzen 7 chip. AMD uses kind of standard naming convention. So a Ryzen 5 is a 4-core CPU. A Ryzen 7 is a 6-core CPU. And a Ryzen 3 is a 2-core CPU. Realistically, you probably want 4 cores nowadays. If you're going for a desktop, just means it'll be able to handle more information for longer than a 2-core counterpart, and it'll be a lot faster. If you do feel like splurging a little bit, I'd recommend going for the Ryzen 7. It'll last a little longer and it'll have a little bit quicker processing speed if you choose to go AMD. Intel did lose market share to AMD this last year, but honestly, their products are relatively similar, so you don't really notice much of a difference. Their Lake series processors are also improving, but I'd actually kind of recommend staying away from those if you don't know the difference. The Lake processors are kind of like their standard Office processor right now, but it's been changing and upgrading, and there's just a lot of variability in the chips that you're going to get. Unless you really know what that product line is offering, you really won't know what that chip is capable of just by name. I'd recommend going for a Core i5 or a Core i7, which is a 6 or 4 core CPU depending on the year. i5s are 6 cores and i7s are 4 cores, but the actual processing speed of those cores is different for those devices. An i5 and an i7, the i7 will probably be faster. The i5 will likely not be as quick. Also, it just has better compatibility with different things. A lot of developers tend to design for Intel chips versus AMD chips. So you might run into 1 or 2 strange errors on an AMD machine that you might not on an Intel, but the cost savings generally kind of overrule that. And you'll see what I'm getting at here on the next slide. Currently, there is a kind of similar CPU market for HPs. They're not the exact same computer, but I kind of try to choose 2 that were pretty much going to put you in the same spot. The Intel i7 Envy, which is a processor that operates at a 2.7 gigahertz standard, but I believe it can throttle up to 3.7 gigahertz right now. So the i7, that's the 10th gen, can actually do quite a bit. It's just marketed standard 2.7 gigahertz. It has 16 gigabytes of RAM, a full terabyte of solid state drive memory, and it comes in black at $799.99 per Best Buy's website. Then there's also a Ryzen 7 model that HP is offering, the Pavilion. It runs on an AMD chip, Ryzen 7, and operates at a standard 3.8 gigahertz, but can throttle upward as well and kind of match the same speeds as the Intel i7. It also comes with 16 gigabytes of RAM, 1 terabyte SSD of memory, and it's silver, not black. Both of the cases look exactly like that, though. And the price is actually a little higher for the Ryzen machine now because it's a little bit better quality. But those prices fluctuate and they go back and forth. So realistically, you're looking at about the same price depending on who you're buying from. This is kind of like the entry point workspace CPU that I'd recommend, one or the other. And I actually have links for these as well. That I will be putting up here after the presentation in the chat window if you want to take a look. But these are just the desktops I'd recommend looking into if you're kind of going into looking for a new computer that'll last you at least 5 to 6 years. Then we also have laptop offerings. And for laptops, I also tried to get a relatively similar comparison between the AMD version and the Intel version. Right now, Intel is a little bit cheaper just because AMD is kind of on the rise, but honestly, you'll probably get about the same performance out of both machines. As you can see, the actual size of the drive is less than the desktop PC counterpart. And the reason for that is laptops are now more designed to take advantage of cloud-based saving and cloud-based service. Most of these are upgradable to a full 1 terabyte, but I'd recommend just getting a separate hard drive if you're going to be walking around with a laptop anyway. The Intel i7 laptop that I have on the right is a HP 15.6-inch touchscreen. It comes with 16 gigabytes of RAM, 512 gigabytes of storage. It is not a 2-in-1, meaning it doesn't have like a touch screen on the front. but it is just a standard laptop, runs on Windows 11. And they also have an i5 version, which is a 6-core but at a lower clock speed. That is less by about $100. That's something that I recommend if you're trying to save $100, but it kind of cuts down on the lifespan of the CPU. It might mean that you're getting a new one 2 years earlier. So I'd really recommend going for the i7, especially if it's just $100 difference. Then there's also a Ryzen 7 laptop that I'd recommend if you're kind of going for something more like a 2-in-1. It has Alexa built in and it has a touchscreen. That's the Dell Inspiron 7000, 2-in-1 14-inch Ryzen 7. It does have a smaller screen size, but the fact that it's a touchscreen and can be used like a tablet kind of makes up for that in my opinion. Also, it has the same amount of RAM, same amount of storage, and it's just about $20 more expensive than the HP version right now. It also runs on Windows 11, so I'd say it's just solidly a better laptop. But they're both relatively about the same, and honestly, either one would work for you. Finally, we're getting more into tablets. First one I'd like to talk about is the Galaxy Tab S7 FE. It's a 12.4-inch screen with 256 gigabytes of memory. It comes with the Samsung Pen, which is similar as like the Apple Pencil if you're an iPhone user. Has 8 gigs of RAM, and it costs $679.99. It comes with a Snapdragon processor, which is pretty good for an ARM PC or ARM processor, and it speeds up to 2.4 gigahertz max. It is similar to an iPad Air, but it's not as good. And the reason is if you're going to get a tablet, I just solidly recommend getting an iPad, honestly. In the tablet market, Apple just dominates. And the reason is because they're just so much better at building tablets than pretty much anyone else. They've had a lot longer at it than pretty much anyone else in the business. And it's just more quality for your product. Now, normally you can't find a comparable product from Apple to like the Galaxies at that price point, but the iPad Air is actually pretty good and probably better than the Galaxy Tab S7. This is the newest iPad Air, the 10.9-inch 64 gigabyte version. It has 8 gigs of RAM, so it matches up to the Galaxy Tab S7 there, and has an Apple M1 chipset. It costs less than the Galaxy Tab S7, coming in at $554.99 for a new iPad Air. At least that's from Walmart. But the one thing I want to point out is the clock speed difference. The Snapdragon processor can process things at 2.4 gigahertz. The Apple M1 chip is at 3.2. And that doesn't look like much, but that's a huge difference. And they both have basically the same amount of cores. So I heavily recommend using the Apple M1 chipset over the Snapdragon. And that's kind of why I say you definitely want to look at Apple if you're going for a little like iPad or a tablet. So that being said, what would you do if you're shopping online? One thing to do would be to kind of narrow down your options, figure out which PC you want based on, the price point, those features we mentioned earlier, the amount of RAM, the amount of memory, just the different sort of features you might want out of it. And then once you find the product that you want, go ahead and compare it online for at least 2 to 3 different sites. And then once you kind of narrow down the best offer, that's what I would go with. I actually have a comparison pulled up for 2 very similar PCs, and I just kind of wanted to walk through how I would look at this as well before we end the presentation. The first PC that we are looking at that I did a search for online was the 5.6-inch touchscreen laptop i7 that I mentioned earlier. This is the HP with 16 gigs of memory and a 512 gigabyte solid state drive. If we scroll down this website, this is Best Buy, it'll give you kind of a look at specifications. It'll give you kind of like this overview up top. It'll tell you kind of how the processor is, kind of how the gigabytes of RAM are, give you the graphics entry information, but this really doesn't tell you a whole lot. It just says, oh, this is entry level, this is a pretty decent amount of RAM, and this is a pretty good processor. But it doesn't really get into the nitty-gritty numbers, which we want to compare. The key specs is really where you want to start looking. It tells you things like the screen size. It'll tell you if it has a touchscreen or not. It'll tell you the processor model and generation, an i7, so we know it's a 4-core CPU with a decent clock speed, and we know that it's 11th gen. Intel just launched their 11th gen, so I know this is a pretty new computer. Intel is in their 11th gen, and Ryzen is in their 5000 series. 6000 series are launching this year. So if you see 5000 or 6000 Ryzen processor and a 10th or 11th gen Intel processor, that's how you know you're getting more of a current computer. The storage type for a laptop, I'd always recommend SSDs. That just means it's a solid state drive, which is faster, but a little less reliable than a classical disk drive or standard hard drive. Almost every computer now will launch with an SSD. I'd recommend getting a standard disk drive as like a backup or an external hard drive, just to back up your data and store it a little longer. It has a total capacity of 512 gigabytes, which is okay for a laptop nowadays. And it has 16 gigabytes of RAM. It also tells you that it runs on Windows 11, which is Windows' newest operating system. If you have a desktop and you haven't upgraded to Windows 11, I'd recommend leaving it at Windows 10. But the newer, devices that are coming out are actually made to operate on Windows 11, so that's fine. It does not have a built-in voice assistant, has a lithium-ion battery, which is standard, and it is not a 2-in-1 design. The other things I want to look at are right here. It says processor, storage, and memory. The processor doesn't tell me anything other than what I said, but it will tell you the number of cores and the processor model number again. The number of cores is just to confirm you're getting what you're looking at. And the storage type, once again, says it's a solid state drive with 512 gigabytes. So that just confirms what it said up above. Memory, and here's where it gets a little tricky. Memory is RAM, and it has RAM here in parentheses, so we know what we're looking at. It has 16 gigabytes, which is a good number. But one thing you might see here that's different between different devices is the DDR type. As it says, based here, each type of RAM delivers a different level of speed, bandwidth, energy efficiency, and performance. And the higher the number of the DDR, that just means that it's a later generation of RAM. DDR4 is what all of the newer chips are using. But if you're getting an older computer, you might see DDR3. DDR4 is going to be faster, but you can't just upgrade and swap between the different generations of RAM. It's all based on how your processor runs things. So if you see a computer using DDR4, that's probably all you're going to see now. That's fine. But if you see something using DDR3, that's another way to tell that it's probably sort of a last-gen product they're trying to get off the line. It'd be fine to use DDR3 now. It's just you wouldn't get as long of life out of that product. It has 12 megabytes of cache memory, has different types of memory slots, and it is expandable up to 16 gigabytes of RAM. What that just means is you're allowed to swap out the RAM type on this computer. You could go in and get it upgraded to a larger amount of memory, but 16 gigs is where it caps. So in this case, you wouldn't be able to upgrade much further. It does also kind of tell you a little bit about the graphics. For most of insurance's case, you really don't need to care about this. The one thing I would mention, though, is that Radeon or that would be AMD processors don't have built-in integrated graphics. Intel does. So what that means is there's a separate part of your computer in Ryzen chips or a Ryzen set computers that actually processes the screen and the graphics that you're seeing. In Intel, that's not necessarily the case. It doesn't really make a difference overall in the computing power, at least nowadays, but it used to. So things to consider. Now let's look at the price. The price here is $829.99. And I pulled up a similar product here on Amazon as well. This is a 2021 HP 15.6-inch touchscreen laptop. It uses an Intel Core i7 computer as well, 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gigabytes of SSD, which is same as the other one. It has Intel Iris graphics, which is slightly different. It has, audio, Bluetooth, doesn't really matter. The key thing to look at here is that it's running Windows 10, and it actually has a higher price point, which is a little bit weird. So let's get into what makes these two models different. Even though they're both HP laptops with, Core i7s, this one's running on a 10th gen, and I can tell that just by what it's saying it right here. That means that it's a last-gen computer selling for a higher price point, so I'd know that I probably want to avoid this version of it. It also just runs Windows 10, so that's another way that I can confirm that it's more of a last-gen product. And if I scroll down into the details of this product, I see here in the description, I look at the processor, it's running a 10th gen Core i7. If I look back at this HP on Best Buy's site, this one's running an 11th Core i7, so this one's going to be faster. I can also tell you that this one is running DDR4 RAM. The Amazon RAM is also DDR4, so that's kind of fine. That's the same, but it's a little bit strange to me. The 10th gen kind of had a back and forth between DDR4 and DDR3. It's interesting that it's running DDR4 because, I just would have assumed it would have run DDR3. It has the same amount of storage, but I think we can tell now that this is a higher priced computer and it wouldn't last as long. So that's just kind of how I compare them and how I know that the HP, that 15.6-inch laptop from Best Buy, is likely the better deal. But that is how I generally go about looking through my computers and choosing a new one online. If you have any further questions, please feel free to let me know. Like I said, my email address is tlevine@crnstone.com, and my number is 513-487-5390. I hope that answered some of your questions, and if you have any other products that you'd like me to look at specifically, or if you just have any questions and you're looking for a computer right now, then I'm happy to answer them. I'll stick around for a few moments, but if you're going to head out, I hope you had a great day and learned something from today's Tech Tuesday. Thanks.